You know, we hear all the time about how powerful AI is getting, but what if I told you that its most important skill, the ability to reason, is built on a foundation that's actually kind of shaky? Well, today we're going to dive into a totally new, brain-inspired approach that might just change the whole game. Let's take a look under the hood of a new kind of artificial brain.
And that really is the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, we see these models spitting out code, writing poems, answering incredibly complex questions, and it sure feels like they're thinking. But are they really, truly reasoning, or is it just a very sophisticated magic trick?
Okay, get ready for this, because this chart is, honestly, it's wild. Researchers gave some of the biggest and best AI models out there a super hard Sudoku puzzle, and look what happened. Claude, DeepSeek, a big fat 0%. They completely and utterly failed. But then look at that last bar, HRM. 55% accuracy. What is going on here?
So, that massive failure? It wasn't a fluke. The research paper behind this puts it perfectly. The core design of today's models is paradoxically shallow. Think of it like this. You have a genius who can instantly solve any one-step problem, but they can't hold a sequence of ideas in their head. For deep, multi-step problems, that shallow architecture becomes a serious bottleneck.
Now, to get around this problem, developers came up with a pretty clever workaround called chain of thought. And if you've used these AIs, you've definitely seen it. It's where you literally tell the model, hey, think step by step. You're forcing it to write out its whole thought process, turning one deep problem into a bunch of shallow little ones it can handle.
But here's the thing. Chain of thought isn't a real solution. It's more like a crutch. Why? Well, for one, it's incredibly fragile. One little mistake early on in the chain, and the whole thing can just fall apart. It's also super slow and inefficient. And crucially, it's not actually thinking internally. It's just showing its work, mimicking a process it learned from tons of human examples.
And all this leads us to a really fascinating question. If the current AI architecture is the problem, where do we even begin to look for a better one? Well, as it so often turns out, the answer is right here, inside our own heads.
So instead of trying to put another Band-Aid on the existing system, these researchers went back to the drawing board. They looked at the most powerful reasoning machine on the planet, the human brain, and asked a simple question. How does that thing actually work?
It turns out when you look at how we humans think, we don't just jump straight to the answer. We think in layers, in a hierarchy. We start at the very top with the big picture, the abstract why behind what we're doing. From there, we figure out what the solution needs to do. Then we get to the actual components, and only at the very end do we figure out how to put it all together. We naturally go from abstract to concrete. And as we're doing this, our brains are constantly switching between two modes. There's lateral thinking, that's the brainstorming phase, where we explore a ton of different ideas. And then there's vertical thinking, where we pick one of those ideas and we dig in deep, refining it and adding all the details. Today's AIs just aren't built to switch between these two modes.
So what if you could build an AI that actually did mimic this human way of thinking? Well, that is the entire idea behind the new model we're talking about today, the HRM. So meet the Hierarchical Reasoning Model, or HRM. Its whole purpose is to do deep, multi-step reasoning internally, inside its own network, without needing to be told to think step by step. It's designed to have its own chain of thought, hidden from view.
The HRM secret sauce comes down to three key principles, all taken directly from neuroscience. First, you've got hierarchical processing, different levels for big ideas in tiny details. Second is temporal separation, the idea that different parts of the network operate at different speeds, kind of like slow and fast brainwaves. And third is recurrence, which lets the model circle back and refine its ideas over and over.
Okay, this is the part where it all clicks. The HRM has two main parts. You've got a high-level module, think of it as the CEO. It thinks slow, sets the grand strategy, the big picture. And then you have a low-level module. That's the engineer. It works fast, cranks through the details, and executes the plan. The CEO gives a directive, the engineer works on it, reports back, and this cycle repeats, creating true computational depth.
So, the theory sounds amazing, right? But does it actually work in practice? Well, the researchers put this new architecture through the ringer on some of the hardest AI tests out there, and the results are, well, they're pretty mind-blowing. First up is the ARC-AGI benchmark. This thing is a notoriously difficult test of abstract intelligence. And just look at this. The HRM, which is a tiny model by today's standards, scores over 40%. It's blowing much, much larger models like Claude 3.7 out of the water.
And get this, it did it after being trained from scratch on only about 1,000 examples. Incredible.
Now, let's go back to that impossible Sudoku puzzle. The difference here is even more obvious. Every single one of the other models scored a perfect 0. They couldn't make any progress at all. Meanwhile, the HRM, with its internal, brain-like reasoning, solves it correctly more than half the time. It's not even a competition.
And it's the exact same story on another really tough task, finding the best path through a complex maze. Once again, you see a sea of zeros for the traditional models, and then the HRM comes in and just crushes it, with nearly 75% accuracy. This isn't just a small improvement. We're talking about a fundamental leap in what these models can do.
So, what does this internal reasoning actually look like? Well, the researchers were able to peek inside the model's brain as it worked. Here, in an early step on that maze problem, you can see it's exploring a bunch of different paths all at once. This is that lateral brainstorming phase in action.
But that's just the start. Fast forward a few steps, and boom, look at that. The model has already thrown out the bad ideas. It is now zeroing in on the single best path. It switched from exploring to refining, from lateral to vertical thinking, all on its own, just like our brains do.
Okay, so the performance is amazing, we get it. But honestly, the most profound discovery from this whole project goes way deeper. It's not just that the HRM acts like a brain. It turns out its internal structure, a structure that emerged completely on its own during training, is also shockingly similar to a real brain.
To understand this, we need a quick concept from neuroscience called the participation ratio, or PR. To put it simply, it's a way to measure how complex a neural network is. A higher PR means the network is using more dimensions to think, which lets it handle more abstract tasks, kind of like the prefrontal cortex in our own brains.
And what the researchers found here is just wow. On the left, that's data from a real mouse brain. As you move from the simple parts of the cortex to the more complex parts, the PR goes up. Now look at the HRM model on the right. It's the exact same pattern. The fast, low-level engineer module has a low PR, and the slow, high-level CEO module has a high PR.
And it gets even more specific than that. The ratio in complexity between HRM's high and low modules is almost 3 to 1. That is remarkably close to the roughly 2.25 to 1 ratio they find in the actual mouse cortex. Remember, nobody programmed this in. The model just figured out on its own that this brain-like structure was the best way to solve problems.
Which brings us all the way back to our very first question, but now with a completely new perspective. This research suggests that by copying the brain's architecture, we're not just getting better scores on a test, we might be unlocking a fundamentally different and more powerful kind of computation. So it forces us to ask, are we moving past just clever mimicry, and are we finally starting to build an AI that can truly think?